Welcome everybody to today's special Global Futures Laboratory seminar. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Kamelamela, who will be our today's speaker. And she will talk, the title actually of the talk is Gathering the Gatherers, Bridging Practice, Policy and Politics of Hawaii's Timber Forest Products. So Katie completed her PhD in botany at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And there she developed a vision of Hawaii's practices on Hawaii's landscapes. So she keeps the diverse climate and soil types of the Hawaiian Islands in mind. She brings together place and practice-based communities and matches that with the needs of policy. Katie's professional and public service goals are to support the understanding and management of forest resources for cultural and economic value, to empower cultivators, managers, and consumers. For that purpose, she uses her experiences with multiple agencies to bridge the gap in communication between on-the-ground practitioners, governing bodies, and advocacy agencies that are preparing for a changing climate. And as we all know, that climate is changing faster than we can actually react to these changes and respond to them. In addition to the doctorate at the University of Hawaii, she holds a master's degree in botany, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Botany and Hawaiian Studies, all from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So with that introduction, I would like to switch over to Katie to deliver her talk.
Thank you, Peter, for introducing me. My name is Katie Kamelamela. I'm calling in from Hawai'i Island. I'm about 20 minutes from the active volcano. And thank you so much for coming and spending your time with me today. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to get into it because I tried to, squeeze in my research, and I just want to get the main points across so I could really share what I want to do in the future, working more with gatherers and policymakers. So I'm going to do a little exercise. We do a little visioning exercise. Unless you have your camera on, I can't see you. So I'm gonna ask you to close your eyes for 30 seconds, and I want you to think about a plant that you grew up with that means a lot to you. It could be a plant that you and your grandparents cultivated together or cooked with, or something that was really important around your dinner table. And just think about why that's important and where that plant is in your life today. You got your plant? Okay. Now imagine that you're no longer able to access that plant at all. Your relationship to that resource is cut off, and you're trying to find a way to extend or reconnect that relationship. And that's what a lot of Indigenous peoples and even people who have moved around the world experience when they move away from their homelands or are distant from their homelands or distant from their culture. They find substitutes or other resources that may give them a similar memory or a similar understanding from their upbringing. And so this is what I focus on in my research, previous, current, and in the future, hopefully, is really uplifting these plant-people relationships from a cultural and economic standpoint, as plants are what humans depend on to make energy, for food, for our cultural, social fabrics, and how we communicate with each other. And so looking at the world from Hawaii, this is what the world looks like if we center Hawaii. We're just a ocean planet from where we are in the middle of the Pacific. And when we zoom in, we see that we're at the center of the Asia Pacific Rim. And historically, we were a port where people would come and stop between Asia and America. Zooming in, our islands are very isolated. We're volcanic shield islands, which means that they're slowly developed, unlike continental crust, which is just all one type. And so it's really the diversity of our islands that influence the diversity of our cultures across Hawaii. So this is just a quick overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to do an introduction, talk about timber and what non-timber forest products are, go over what my professional processes and foundations are in doing my research as being a Native Hawaiian scientist and working with the Native Hawaiian communities is important to me. And then I'll be going over my previous non-timber forest product research, my current policy research with community-based forests, and my goals for future research. So just up front, the main message of this presentation is, as evidenced by the research that we've been able to do, Hawaiian cultural events and markets highlight native species. So native, indigenous, found in Hawaii and other places, as well as endemic, only found in Hawaii. This was done through in-person as well as online surveys. We were able to identify major, what I want to call charismatic megafauna. They would be like your polar bears of the plant world in Hawaii. So koa, important hardwood, maile, izale, and other hula plants. The importance of this non-timber forest product work is that we've been able to highlight that the management strategies that practitioners use align and reflect what conservationists are already doing. Sometimes there's a thought that indigenous practices or local knowledge is exclusive of conservation, but in my observations and interviews, I've recorded that there's actually a lot of alignment and understanding in the preservation of the plants, not just for, scientific sake, but also for cultural and economic value. So my core of my research really comes from ethnobotany, the study of people and their relationships with plants. And as defined by the Declaration of Kauai, which was signed by 44 ethnobotanists and associates, is that ethnobotany is the science of survival. As Peter said, we're not able to adjust to climate as quickly, or the accelerations are so quick. We need different approaches. Indigenous people steward the highest or the hot spots of biodiversity in the world. And really, this is because they're doing it in a sustainable way where what they're gathering is, their gathering rate is slower than the production rate of the plants. And we can identify this through ethnobotanical and ethnoecological research methods. Though it says ethnobotany, this does span from the mountains to the ocean and includes things like seaweed. So again, Hawaii is very isolated. And so we do have these dubious distinctions of high endemism, plants only found in Hawaii, high rates of endangered species, accounting for 49% nationally in the United States. And we also have a high rate of extinction. This is due to the microclimates, the change in climate, the introduction of mosquitoes, impacting birds, and also construction happening with development of lands. And so again, these are our islands. We are active volcano on Hawaii Island. So besides human impacts, we also have natural elements which are able to remove items from the landscape. When we're looking at our landscape, again, volcanic shields, The rainfall is very different. Unlike the continental United States, where you could drive for 2 hours in the same climate, I drive down the road 10 minutes and I'm in a different climate zone. Either way, I go up and down the road. So the sensitivity of environmental changes in Hawaii is very acute because of the specific rainfall patterns and our microclimates. And part of our story in Hawaii is how these plants arrived. I've already mentioned native, endemic, indigenous, but part of our story is also the introduction of Polynesian, or what are known as Polynesian or canoe plants, which, now that we know, our Hawaiians brought with us over on our voyage. And then we have another marker for plant introductions, which is 1778, which is when Captain Cook arrived and the start of outside products came in to Hawaii. And this conversation is important later on, as I discover that some people view Polynesian introduced plants, specifically Native Hawaiians, as native plants, which is different than we would in the botanical discipline. So working with all of this, ethnobotany is really about leaning into what can be local knowledge or indigenous local knowledge, a few terms. And the real main thing is that people have knowledge of the species and environmental phenomena, past and present. They practice livelihood activities, so may not just be economic, but could be subsistence. And then their belief in where they are in the landscape. This image in the background is of one of the sites that I did a case study at. And the people I worked with believe that these mountains are their ancestors as well as the ocean. And so when you have those types of beliefs, this really influences how you engage with your environment. Putting this into a model, kind of flipping Berkey's upside down, I look at how people believe their relationship to be. Observations are different than what people tell you sometimes, so it's good to confirm. The practice that people go through sometimes is individually learned, but also may be informed by previous or older generations, sometimes even in younger generations. And all of this is built upon our personal values, our cultural traditions, and our community values. In essence, a sense of belonging to place and to a community, to people. And so traditional ecology was manifested into natural resource management divisions. This is going to be my short attempt to try and share what that looks like. So this is the island I'm on right now. This map was made in 1910. And so this is the island, or the moku of Hawaii, Hawaii Island. In this blue here is also known as a moku, but it's a large land division in Hawaii. So I live in the moku of Puna. And then further is this Ahupua'a, which is a small and even smaller land division. So you can see that there's a scaffolding to natural resource management historically in Hawaii. And so within the island of Hawaii and the moku of Puna, I live in the Ahupua'a of Waikahekahe. And then even smaller land division is this little dot. And so that would be the Ili, or the smallest land division that I live in. And why I'm bringing this up is because this is how some practitioners still look at the landscape. And so when they're talking about place names, it's really important because those place names are their relationships with the environment, the memories, and the future that they want to see. prior to photography. This is what the landscape was. This is the landscape that was captured prior to photography on Oahu in Manoa Valley. So you can see there wasn't much construction in the early 1900s, and obviously things have changed. So in this type of landscape, you would have more resources to gather than in this type of landscape on the right-hand side, which is the ocean side of the images you just saw. So Waikiki is the most popular tourist destination in Hawaii. And I thought that it was a good image to share. This was 1923, before statehood. And so you can see there was still some construction done with this canal, which is still there, and some movement of some traditional land areas. Whereas today, this picture was from 2018, there's no place for a natural landscape to kind of be engaged in a traditional way that it would be in 1923. So the areas that people are able to gather from are being restricted, again, because of natural reasons such as volcanoes, human incurred reasons such as construction, and not just for personal, but also for commercial tourism endeavors. So that's kind of just the basic background of Hawaii, and I'm just gonna go into what timber and non-timber forest products are. Most people are familiar with timber products. We go to the hardware store, we get lumber, we need new furniture, get flooring, paper. Those are kind of the major wood products that come from the trunk of the tree that we're most familiar with. In Hawaii, because we're islands, our timber industry is nascent. It's still being grown. It's still cultivating itself. Different issues with growing trees, processing trees, and then, distribution as well. And the forest inventory assessment conducted by the United States Forest Service, because Hawaii has so many other forest resources that are used besides wood, they're very interested in what we had available. And so non-timber forest products are not just used in Hawaii, but all around the world, and include things like nuts, seeds, medicinal plants, fruits, flowers, bark, leaves, resin, fuel wood or firewood, and different minerals. So it's not necessarily restricted to plants, even though it may infer that. But the idea is to identify a cultural and economic value beyond a planked wood or flooring. And the main goal of looking at non-timber forest products is to create sustainable harvest management plans and conservation strategies so that we're able to harvest, again, at a slower rate than what is being produced on the landscape. And so this is one of the publications I contributed to with the Forest Service, specifically in the cultural dimensions. So I wrote about the Hawaii experience, but there's also experiences of Alaska, the Southwest, Northeast, all areas related to cultural dimensions for ceremony, again, medicine, and different practices. And so why Hawaii? Why Hawaii with non-timber forest products? Why go to the middle of the ocean? The main reason was that the International Montreal process, which creates a guide or created a guide of criteria and indicators to assess the health of non-timber forest products, didn't have any information about Hawaii specifically. There are legal canons of law and cases that support subsistence practices of Native Hawaiians, but the authors were not able to find any non-timber forest product references in Hawaii. Previous documentation of practices was last conducted in 96 or last published in 96 by Dr. Isabella Abbott, who has passed since then. And so my research was to follow up on her work and to bring our information up to date. And so in Hawaii, this is what non-timber forest products look like. You can have bowls or weavings. Sometimes this isn't Native Hawaiian, but we have a large Japanese population that immigrated over for plantation. So karamatsu, or which celebrates Japanese New Year's. This is a mailele and food. So these are just like some ideas of the products that I worked with and the locations that I worked at. But you can see that these resources are interwoven in the fabric of Hawaii. So we're closing out the Hawaii non-timber forest product forestry inventory assessment, general technical report. And this is, again, the first assessment of contemporary gathering practices in Hawaii since 1996. It's the first exhaustive statewide assessment of non-timber forest products in the nation. And the methods that are used to evaluate cultural and economic value of non-timber forest products are being utilized as standards to explore in different states how we can get a better understanding of the total contributions forests are making to our economies and to our social fabrics. This research is important because no one really did it before. We currently have over 161 plants, I believe, recorded. And so we're just starting and it's the tip of the iceberg. Work being conducted by people such as Frank Lake at the Forest Service are really trailblazing a way for Indigenous resource management to be integrated into the landscape. And Hawaii is really primed for this, not just because we have this list of plants, but we're also working on our first community-based subsistence forest area, which is being directed by lineal descendant Native Hawaiian community members. So we're not just talking about it, we're doing it on the land, and we're learning and sharing our lessons. So really quickly, I'm just going to go through my process of how I got here. Yeah, it seems weird for a botanist to care about policy and politics when you look at this slide a little bit, but it's really critical for the work that I do, considering the support of Native Hawaiian subsistence practices by state rules, by different cases. And so for me to understand that, I really immersed myself into these areas. And so this is a chant for one of the first communities that I worked with. Idio ku'iwi, eo koko ku'ukoko, eo pili kamo'o a mauloa, kalahui Hawaii kamanava ku. And so my research intention is really to engage Native Hawaiians and people of the land, and to continue on these practices that create who we are as people. And this cannot only be applied in Hawaii, but around the world, as many of our traditions in this accelerated climate are not being engaged as much as they used to be. And so from an anthropological view, Emek, I'm from within the culture. Obviously, I'm Native Hawaiian. Within the culture, I view it as a female, and I'm a practitioner doing different ceremonies. So that's different than someone else who may be not Hawaiian and who maybe is not engaged in ceremony. But then I am also professionally trained as a scientist. So I also don't have the same upbringing as a lot of people that I work with. I grew up in the city. I was encouraged not to go to the forest and the ocean without a partner. And we do have gender roles within Hawaii. So I do observe those when appropriate in the field. And so my vision for my research is makahana ka'ike, makahana kamana. In the work is the knowledge, and in the work is the power. My mission for almost 10 years now has been to carry out and promote research relevant to the preservation of people's interactions with plants, in perpetuation of communal and cultural practices. So not focusing on the individual, but really looking at practices that uplift the entire community is really where I think is important. Practice, policy, and politics. And I'm just going to share my personal experiences before diving into the research. So the practices I've done up to this point, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but doing research in Hawaii as someone who has grown in Hawaii and is Hawaiian is very rare. So it is part of who I am, as well as other arts. Some of them which I've done and included into my research. So engaging in Hawaiian games changes our mind frame, doing the trail maintenance so we have access, engaging ceremony, bringing practices to the public, not keeping them at personal homes, but actually bringing them out to parks, doing performances and doing the practice, and not just what people view as Hawaiian practices, but also advocacy for Native Hawaiian rights. It's a really big part of who I've become. And through practice, I've learned that there's different levels of decision making. This is just one model that I used to share with some emerging professionals of where we can engage, not just as Native Hawaiians, but as conservationists who are doing the work and can inform policy. So I worked at most of these levels. I've worked at the local level in policy, with Native Hawaiian organizations, the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii, worked in the Democratic Party of Hawaii as a chair of a district. So helped to support the transition of a congressman and fill that seat. Nationally, I've worked within Congress as a fellow. So understanding how federal policy works and how the communication is. I'm currently an executive committee member on the Sierra Club of Hawaii for the state. So we're working with the Red Hill battle, which is basically the military has a jet fuel leak and it's poisoning the aquifer on Oahu. And then internationally also engaging with Indigenous areas of policy. And this is super important because not many people get these experiences. And because I sought them and seek them, I have a better understanding of how we can communicate with policymakers, how we can communicate with practitioners, and what are the steps that we can create solutions moving forward. The politics part of it is actually engaging in the process, not just working for the process, but engaging the process, again, at different levels in different areas. And it was really, again, my work in DC that really opened up my eyes into this politics area as one of the only people in the office who'd lived in Hawaii in the last 20 years. My responsibility was to take care of all of Hawaii requests. And so because we represented Hawaii, we got a lot of Hawaii requests. And so it's kind of getting into the nitty gritty. So this all informed my research and how I go about it. So I'm gonna try and do this as gently as possible because there's just a lot and I tried to cherry pick what was going on. So the main questions I asked, I kind of did two studies for my pilot. One was a practice-based study and one was a place-based study. So this practice-based study was really focused on what was going on before, what were they cultivating, and what were they cultivating in a specific area that was going on. So I did a case study for those. And the goal of that was to not burden people who I would be engaging with and put the expectation on them to teach me their ways when those ways have already been published in books. So that's also part of the practice, is doing the homework before you get into the field. And so the place-based pilot questions is what is currently being gathered. So this was in Ahupua'a, so a smaller land division on Oahu, to a specific place. After looking at the initial findings, people were engaged in gathering mostly for imu or underground oven practices, also known as a fire pit or a pit cook on Turtle Island. And so we really wanted to see, like, what are the implications for conservation in Hawaii in this? These are the methods that I used. For the historical, I looked at these books. For my Ahupua'a study, this is the area I looked at and the families that I worked with. I did semi-structured interviews, which built on this previous research. And then I finally did a structured online survey for the state. So I went from really specific to really broad in the practices of imu. This is the area again of the Ahupua'a we studied. This is an image of the underground oven and the general process. The image is when we're taking it out of the oven. I believe this one, we had about 2,000 pounds of meat. We were feeding a lot of people for a conference. And my main findings, which is a lot, but what I really want to highlight is historically, I was able to identify 196 plants that were recorded to be gathered in Hawaii. And then within just focusing on the Ahupua'a of Hakipu'u, there was 44 plants that we recorded over like a 2-year period. When we expanded the underground oven talk story, we eventually got up to 130 plants based on building or scaffolding the methods. Prior to this, the only references for underground ovens were in children's books. So the importance of this information is that it allows practitioners to evolve and adapt. And so when people were asked at this stage of the research, what did they want to see in the future? These are the plants that they mentioned that they wanted to see in the future. In the blue, those are native. In the blue is Polynesian introduced species, black is native, and red is introduced 1778 and actually seen as an invasive species in Hawaii. And then when people shared categories of what they wanted to see, the main thing they said was native plants. And so I'm just going to bring this up real quick. Although people said majority, they wanted to see Polynesian introduced plants, as a group, they said they wanted to see native plants. And so this kind of brought me to an idea in my early on in my research that it's important to know what people consider native. Because I'm a botanist, I can't assume that everybody thinks of what native or endemic is because of my training. And so what I found with Kiave or prosopis, which is a native plant in Arizona actually, is that conservation may view X plant as invasive and abundant, while users may understand it to be a resource in decline. And that's really critical when you talk about the relationship between conservationists and practitioners, which can be a little, I don't know, there might be some friction there sometimes because of different understandings. And I think this is important for research and working with Indigenous communities, because if we want to include people in our research, it's not just about engaging them physically, but also linguistically including them moving forward. And this research was also important because it highlights on the left-hand side, prior to privatization of land in Hawaii in 1850, the red represents where people could access resources publicly. On your right-hand side is the current status, or as of 2019, where people are able to gather. And so if you see, there's a really big difference in accessibility. And so when we did that exercise in the beginning of imagine a plant that you're really close with, that you really grew up with, and then not having access, that is what this map is about. And that is the feeling that not just Native Hawaiians, but many Indigenous peoples and people removed from their lands feel constantly. So thank you for engaging in that activity. Moving forward with the PhD, I did a general understanding of statewide non-timber forest products, working with the Division of Land and the Department of Land and Natural Resources, Division of Forestry and Wildlife, who manages the plant permit request for the forest. So I just wanted to know or ask what's currently being gathered, and again, what are the implications? Previously, we've seen that red and green map. This one shows a little bit more nuance of who owns the land and how you're able to access. So this hatched area is that public access land for the forest. And then you can see blue, which is large private land holdings, is a good chunk of the land represented, as well as on Lanai. So similarly to my previous also engaged, the only difference here really is the permit part. We went to events, cultural events, and then we also went to markets, farmers markets and cultural markets, did structured surveys and also online market surveys of like the House of Christie's and things like that to identify how far Hawaii gathered forest products are being sold from Hawaii. And so these are my general findings for all of those questions and all of those methods. In this process, we were able to identify 166 plants. It was more extensive, it was more broad. It wasn't just focused on underground practices, but anything that people did. So we had a bigger area to work with. And so the main findings of all of this previous research is there's an idea sometimes that Native peoples are perhaps ruining the forest because of their uses of plants, and that the number of native plants they're using is very substantial. But what my research shows is that of the native plants we have in Hawaii, 4% are being gathered that are native and 3% are endemic. Of the threatened and endangered species that we have in Hawaii, 0.7% are being gathered. And I feel like that's a really powerful narrative, which also supports Indigenous peoples cultivating biocultural biodiversity hotspots. So we actually have information that illustrates not that Native Hawaiian practices or gathering practices aren't impinging the forest, but the proportion that people may think it's happening at is a lot smaller. So for management, in the 2020s, gathering practices are still important for subsistence, cultural, and economic value. Again, the management practices of practitioners are reflective of conservation practices. There's less than 4% of native species being gathered by Native Hawaiians. And we can also improve the monitoring process that's currently engaged, and include practitioners in those metrics. So very quickly, currently building all of the non-timber forest product research and underground ovens. What I'm currently looking at is Indigenous local knowledge of drought in Hawaii. So this is stemming from the request for practitioners to look at climate change, to look at how can they adapt their practices in the forest. And with these two projects, how do we integrate Indigenous knowledge of dry landscapes into conservation? So for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been facilitating the Pu'uwa'awa'a community-based subsistence forest area, which is the first community forest area on state lands being proposed, again, being led by Indigenous community members. And I think what has been the most successful for that project is people's awareness of practice, policy, and politics. And that awareness allows us to move as a unit. And then also working with different Indigenous groups on creating climate adaptation plans, which achieve their goals. In working with the community-based subsistence forest area, I recognized a lack of acknowledgement for the land, which is the primary focus for our community members, a limited acknowledgement for policy, which really brings us to a fiduciary duty as scientists and as citizens, and like a lack of acknowledgement of values. So land acknowledgements have been gaining popularity on Turtle Island, North America, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. And sometimes they can be very empty. Recognizing somebody on their land is one thing. Recognizing their right to sovereignty and putting action to that is a different vibe. And that's what we're going for. We're going for systemic change here. And this acknowledgement frame is just one way that I've been able to communicate how we can move forward within the structures that we have today, and including Indigenous practitioners. So just moving forward, I want to continue doing a greater movement of gathering the gatherers. We did a pilot in 2017. It was really successful, and we got really great feedback from our participants who were practitioners, lawyers, decision makers, scientists, anybody that contributed or contributes to the narrative of gathering practices from the mountains to the oceans. It's really critical to have these voices at the table, and they're not there. And so we really want to create a safe space to talk about subsistence. What does that mean to practitioners, and how we can integrate that further into policy so that they feel reflected in the law. Potential Arizona state operations could include supportive gathering the gatherers with a physical space to actually gather at, up in Iole, possibly in Kohala on Hawai'i Island. That place is ethnobotanically focused already and is really known for building leadership in the islands. So the goals of gathering gatherers, again, would be identifying policies and procedures, next steps for potential solutions, and creating policy language for submission to the state for consideration. Also amplifying mountain, ridge to ocean reef research. This has been going on a while in Hawaii, And because we are islands, we are like this microcosm laboratory, and getting this experience out because of climate change, because of changing climates, because of us being on our islands, we're able to monitor this at a more visible rate than other places which have larger land areas. So thank you to everyone for attending today, to the College of Global Futures for having me, Hawaii community members, and the landscapes we're on. These are some of the community members and organizations who have supported the non-timber forest product work since we've started. And I really appreciate all of you for being here. Thank you. I think we might have time for questions. Mahalo.
Thank you, Katie, for a great talk. We do have time for questions. So if anybody has a question, I think you just can put it into the chat and I will collect them. While people are thinking about that, Katie, to which extent can practices in Hawaii be extended to other areas where you have similar issues of land management, cultivation, stewardship, etc., by indigenous communities? And we know, and you mentioned that a large fraction of the land actually is held by indigenous communities.
Yeah, I think it can, and actually, there's a lot of communication between indigenous communities, even if it may not be public. And I think that's really the way that we're able to work through these issues better. Like an example would be engaging with people in the Arctic. It doesn't seem similar because we're islands, but the Arctic and the islands have the most extreme impacts of climate change. And so we're able to exchange stories together, which maybe people in other land type areas may not really experience. And so it's really important for those continual cross exchanges between indigenous communities and people of practice. Sometimes people of practice are not indigenous to the community and have been adopted, which is totally 100% fine. But when I talk, I just want to be like clear about the practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually interesting that indigenous people from the Arctic and Hawaii are having that exchange. And you're right, it's not that well known. Personally, I work quite a bit in high latitude, so we did work with people in Arctic communities, and yeah, they, as everybody knows, the amplitude of climate change is really high there. And so it's interesting to see that there is this exchange. Katie, do you actually see the questions? If not, I just go ahead, and you just can take the next two that are from Nikki and Alicia.
Okay, how do you envision the policy priorities as they relate to people's interactions with plants? So the main priority that I'm aware of authoring the recommendations for the state on their next step, they've actually completed, I'd go with like 75% of the recommendations. And the last part is including practitioners in the permit process, including practitioners in how to monitor or how to engage these resources. Currently related to permits, and my assessment was the first one conducted for the state. So that was in 2016, and they started collecting in 2007. So there's a gap in management, one, and I believe that because of that gap, they're not able to best serve their citizenry due to limited funding. And so having the gathering of the gatherers would potentially alleviate that burden process from the state, include practitioners as well as the state, because they were there at the first meeting, and really get some traction going on a conversation where people don't feel, I guess, watched. When the state leads talks, it's different than if a third party leads a talk. And so that's really the importance of creating a safe space. I hope that answers the first question, Mickey. And then your second is, how does public access to land align with these goals? So public access to land, how is the best way to say that? Thank you for letting me think right there. But the access to the land is already there. What is missing is the understanding of the policy, not just by the implementers, honestly, but also the practitioners and the intention of why we would want to collect that information. Public access in Hawaii includes subsistence practices. It's part of the permit process, actually. There's personal permits, subsistence, commercial permits for sale, and then there's cultural permits, which exceed personal amounts and is used for specific cultural purpose. And all of this is facilitated by the state on public lands. The issue, reframing that, the opportunity is that these lands aren't being managed per se by the land manager, by the state. They're more often being managed by practitioners who are going into the forest. And so how does this public access to land align with these goals? It's part of the original Hawaiian Kingdom law. So the Hawaiian Kingdom was overthrown in 1893. The territory of Hawaii came in, and then the state of Hawaii adopted some of the same laws that the Hawaiian Kingdom had on the books. In 1978, Native Hawaiian rights were added and are codified into our state constitution and protected. So it's not only aligning, it's like an actual right for Native Hawaiians as lineal descendants to access these lands. When you talk about the general public, I think that that's just we need to have more conversations about what that is, since a lot of the focus is preservation of Native Hawaiian practices. I hope that answers your question, Mickey.
I just see that Alicia's, it was actually a comment, not a question. And Mickey.
Oh, talk about, yeah, Mickey's asking what I'd want to teach about. I think for undergraduate, I really am passionate about ethnobotany. I really believe that learning how different people engage with plants opens up our mind to other ways and life ways of being. So not just food and medicine, but also things like religious symbols in flags, at Christmas, during Easter. Those are also part of ethnobotany languages that I would like to encourage students to lean into. Many times we're encouraged just to stay with our community, and ethnobotany didn't just teach me about other communities, but reinforced who I was as a Native Hawaiian as it was taught at the University of Hawaii. Another course I would be interested in developing and teaching is a new movement that's been going on called Kindness in Science. So rather than focus on Indigenous research methodologies, which are great, I think that sometimes it can pigeonhole or make people feel uncomfortable. And there's greater ethics involved in science, which include kindness at different levels, not just doing work in the field, but publications and collegial relationships, and really teaching students early on that these are the soft skills that will support your success as a scientist in community, I think are really important to me. And then for graduate school, building on these and doing a field methods course in Hawaii, ideally, so that we can engage not just in the landscape and the ecology or the ethnobotany, but where community and culture hit the road. So not providing the vacation experience of Hawaii, but providing the educational experience of Hawaii at a graduate level, I think would be really useful for the lab in Hawaii.
So there is no other question. We are also just 1 minute away from our scheduled time. So let me thank Katie again for a great talk. Let me thank everybody who attended. And with that, we can close today's seminar session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.